So how's everyone doing this morning? Good morning. Good, good. Okay, I'm glad to see you all here. I hope you're ready for a fun time of worship. I like to have a little bit of fun, so hopefully you do too. But if you don't, well, just bear with me and just grin and bear it, okay? We'll get through it. So this week we're going to be finishing up the series on Restart. And Pastor's been laying out week by week how we can restart now that things are kind of coming to a close, although who knows what the future holds. But last week, he covered investment. He covered this concept of investment over the pandemic period, and he asked us to take a look at where you have been investing your time, effort, and resources in regards to the eternal, the heavenly kingdom, but as well as the temporary, your worldly endeavors. And so as we continue this series, we are going to move on from that. And this week we're going to be looking at the concept of back to the future. I really wanted a DeLorean up here. They said it wasn't in the budget, so I did not get the DeLorean. But the concept is back to the future. Because like everyone, before this pandemic hit, many people had set plans for their future for 2020. And then the pandemic hit, and it changed everyone's plans. And yet, at the beginning of the year, each of us had set some goals. And Jesus had also set some goals through Pastor for this church. And so we want to get back to the vision Jesus had for us. We really want to look and see where is it that we can kind of get back on track, because this pandemic has been a distraction. I think we can all agree that we've all had some distraction here. Now, let me ask you guys a question. Have you ever been on a road trip and been so distracted you missed your exit? Missed your exit. Go ahead, give me a show of hands. Okay, so a few people have done that. How about this? Have you ever been on your way to, say, maybe a restaurant or something, you're having a great conversation, and you just completely missed your turn? Distractions are inevitable, right? Some of them are even pleasant distractions. I mean, odds are your mind was elsewhere. All right, now how about this one? This has never happened to me, except any day ending in Y. Have you ever daydreamed at work and lost your place of what you were doing? Okay, yeah. It's part of life, right? Distractions happen. And so the question is, how do we deal with them? What do they lead to? Do they take us away from the goal we had started out to achieve and lead us down a completely separate path? Or do we find a way to get redirected? And that's what we're going to kind of look at today. So as I was thinking through this, there's been many times in life where distractions have caused us to rethink things, right? Maybe you get distracted by something happens, a moment of crisis happens, and you literally have to replan the way you do some things. So this happened to the Sorois family, boy, it's been a while now, probably about 13 years ago now. Derek was 3 years old. We were heading over my parents' house, and they had a pool. They had not yet had one of those little fences you put around the pool. I think you can kind of see where this is going, okay? So Derek is 3 years old. We're driving over to their house, and I'm talking up how awesome the pool is because he's never gone swimming yet, okay? And so I, as a good dad, I'm sitting there telling him, man, you're going to have so much fun. I said, you get to swim like a fish. You get to jump like a cannonball. There are so many cool things you can do in a pool. This is going to be awesome. So the whole ride over, which was about a 30-minute ride, he's hearing this awesome stuff at the pool. Now, as any good father who's not thinking about, they're just thinking about the fun, I completely neglected to mention that there needs to be safety around a pool, okay? So Derek's heard all the fun stuff and heard none of the things like, hey, you shouldn't jump in a pool without floaties or something of that nature because he's 3. He doesn't know how to swim, okay? So we get to my dad's house, back door's open. I'm talking to my parents. Teresa's getting the kids set up, okay? She's just getting them set up. At this time, Bella's a baby. The twins are about 2 years older than Derek, and so we have 2 5-year-olds, a 3-year-old, and a baby. So Teresa's getting them set up. I'm talking to my mom and my dad, and Derek is thinking, where's this pool? And so he wanders off. And he's just going along, and next thing I know, I hear that ever familiar sound when someone has jumped in a pool. Derek has jumped into the pool at 3 years old. No floaty on. No one's at the pool. So naturally, I run out, I hop in, and I get him out. But that moment of crisis was exceptionally scary. Exceptionally scary. Your 3-year-old just stepped into the pool, and you, first of all, you do rethink those moments where maybe I should have mentioned something on safety, but let's not bring this up now. The other thing you think of is how many of you, when something goes wrong, you play the blame game? Okay, you don't want to initially say it's you. Yeah, that was me. I was like, Mom, Dad, why don't you have a fence up around your pool? Like, what is it, my job to watch my own children? This is crazy. That was my initial reaction. Needless to say, they also did take some precautions. By the next time we came over, they had a fence around that pool, so kudos to them. But with that being said, we have these moments of crisis that hit us, and sometimes instead of assessing what we can do better, where we may have went off the course, we play the blame game, and we tend to not actually do anything productive through or with the crisis. And I kind of want to look at that today. Our passage today is going to be in Matthew chapter 14, so if you want to join me in Matthew chapter 14. But if there's anything you get out of this sermon today, here's what I want you to get, okay? When distracted by crisis, refocus on Christ. Okay, if you get nothing else out of today, get that. When distracted by crisis, refocus on Christ. See, crises are going to happen in life on a small level where your child can step into a pool, but also, as we know in this world today, day and age, on a large level where we get hit by a pandemic. And so when you're distracted by a crisis, we have to learn how to deal with it. So if you'll join me in Matthew chapter 14, picking up in verse 28, we're going to be looking at the passage where Peter walks on the water, okay? And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. So let me bring us up to speed real quick. This incident takes place in Matthew 14 right after Jesus feeds the 5,000 plus people. And after he feeds these 5,000 plus people, he tells his disciples, I want you to get in the boat, head to the other side, I'll meet you there. He sends all the crowds away, and he goes up into a mountain to pray by himself. We see this often, where the Lord takes time to refresh himself with his Father. And so he goes up to the mountain to pray by himself. And as the disciples are sailing, a storm picks up, okay? So they have a storm picking up, winds howling all around, waves are crashing against them. Naturally, they are awake. And this is happening right around the evening hours, okay? We're looking at later in the evening, so it's dark, it's stormy. And the Lord decides he's going to rejoin them by walking to them on the water. So the first thing they think when they see someone walking on the water in a storm is, that's a ghost. That's how they reacted. And I can't say as though I blame them. I may have reacted the same way. I certainly wouldn't think that was really the real live Jesus walking to me at first. So this is what's going on. And this is when Peter, who wants to confirm that this is Jesus, says, the only way to confirm this is to step out of this boat and walk on water, so let me just do that. I'm not sure that would have been my first course of action, but as I know from Soroy's history, sometimes we just want to walk on water. Thank you, Derek. So here is Peter. One of the things I love about Peter is he always wants to do great things with and for Jesus, and he's willing and ready at the drop of a pin to do something. He'll even drop that pin. And so here he is in this case. He asked the Lord, bid me to come unto thee. And so let's pick it up in 29, and this is what Jesus responds. And he said, come. Pretty simple. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. So here is Peter. He asks, and Jesus says, that's a pretty simple request. Yeah, I can handle that. Yeah, come on. Come on and do it. So that's what Peter does. Steps out of the boat, gets ready to walk on water. Let's look at the next verse, verse 30. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. I want to pause in this verse for a little bit, okay? So here is Peter. He takes that initial step of faith that many of us probably wouldn't even have had the courage to take. So keep in mind as we learn some things out of this passage, I am not knocking Peter because I'm not even sure I'd be the one to step out of the boat in the middle of a storm. But here he is. He is now experiencing a moment of crisis. He's decided he's going to trust Jesus to allow him to walk on water, which is physically impossible. So he's trusting in Jesus for a miracle. And as he does so, initially he is walking towards Jesus. He is focused on Jesus, and everything is going smooth. And then Peter gets distracted. And I saw three things in this verse that jumped out at me. He's distracted by three things. So Peter is first distracted by looking at what's happening around him. He stopped focusing on Christ, and it tells us, and he noticed that the winds were boisterous. There was a howling wind going around. There were large waves. And he can't help but notice he's distracted by what is happening around him. And that's what crises do to us. They take our focus off the goal, and we can't help but for the moment be immediately focused on what is happening around us. You kind of lose sight of everything else. But once you do that, it leads to more distractions, as rabbit trails often do. And so once he's distracted by that, we see the second thing Peter's distracted by. He's distracted by the fear that this produces. It tells us, and he was afraid. See, because he took his focus off of Christ. He took his focus off the goal that was set before him, and he was just focusing on what was happening around him. All of a sudden, what was happening around him created a fear, an internal fear that he couldn't control. And now he starts focusing in on this fear of what could happen. And I want to submit to you that that's the next thing that happens in a crisis moment. Once you start just concentrating on the crisis itself, you can't help but concentrate on the fear of what could happen. It captivates your mind, it captivates your thoughts. You start to constantly find yourself thinking about it. And here's the reality, once you are only thinking on that, you are no longer thinking on the goals or the future you had set. You are no longer thinking on the task that you were trying to accomplish, because everything now is focused on this fear of what could happen based on looking at what is happening around you and focusing on just that. And the last thing we see Peter gets distracted by in this verse is Peter gets distracted by just trying to survive. Once you get to that point in a crisis, all you can look at is how to survive. And once you get into a survival mode, you stop thinking about your future. You stop thinking about the goals you set. You change everything just to survive. And that's what happens to Peter in this verse. And then it just struck me. This is what happens to each of us when we allow the crisis in our lives to take center stage. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying a crisis shouldn't change the way you do things. I'm very grateful my parents decided to put a gate around their pool. I thought twice before telling my children about all the fun and not actually mentioning there's some safety precautions. I'm not saying it shouldn't make you smarter, but it shouldn't stop you from swimming. It shouldn't stop you from moving forward. And likewise, when the crisis hits you, it shouldn't stop you from trying to accomplish those goals that you believe God set in your heart at the start of the year. It just might mean you have to go about them differently. When distracted by crisis, refocus on Christ. Let's see how Jesus responds in verse 31. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? So Jesus naturally immediately saves Peter. At no time was Peter's life in real danger, and we know that as we read through the Bible. We grasp that. We have hindsight. It's 2020. But Peter didn't have that at the time. But at no point was Jesus going to let Peter perish there. And that's why Jesus poses this question to him, O thou of little faith, why didst thou doubt me? When you think this through, as Jesus was talking to me and asking me to bring to you, understand every time someone brings a message or a lesson, God talks to that person and beats down on their heart first to then share with you. And this is the question he posed to me as I'm reading through this passage. And he says, Nate, do you trust me to help you achieve the goals I set for you? At no time was he taken by surprise by the pandemic or anything else that is happening in this country or in this time. He is not shocked by it. He is not wondering how it all happened. He knew it was going to happen, and yet he still asked me this. He's like, I'm pretty sure I had foresight of what was going to happen when I asked you to accomplish these goals. What are you doing to achieve it? Specifically, I was thinking about our church wanted to reach out into the community this year. We were challenged with that. Each of us were, myself included. And I've let this pandemic, this time, kind of distract me from that. Matter of fact, I even allowed it to use it as an excuse to not seek out how I could get involved in this community. I allowed it to impact my everyday decisions, and then Jesus brings me to this passage when Pastor presented me with the opportunity to preach, and he's like, yeah, you need to address this question in your own heart. So the question he posed to me is the question I pose to you. Have you looked for opportunities to carry out his vision? Or have you, like I did, allowed these events, these moments of crisis to distract you? Have you concentrated on what's been happening around, the fear of it, the survival of it? Are we so consumed with that we are ignoring what he's asked us to do? And I can't answer that for you. I can only answer it for me. I know on my part, I've had to spend the last week getting right with God over this. I've had to spend this last week getting down on my hands and knees and asking him, well, how can I do it? And he's been showing me avenues. And I really hope that you will do the same. So the question becomes, how should I respond? I mean, the answer is simple. How we carry it out might not be, but the answer is simple. You just have to refocus your concentration. Refocus on Christ. When distracted by crisis, refocus on Christ. And I want to offer 3 ways we can do that. I want to look at 3 different ways that we can refocus on Christ. Number 1, instead of just concentrating on what is happening, refocus on this. Refocus from what is happening to how you can help others while this is happening. See, each of us have a sphere of influence. Each of us have opportunities that the other person doesn't have. We might work in different places. know different people, live in different neighborhoods. Regardless, you have opportunities that other people here don't have. And so the question is, are you focusing on what's happening around you instead of focusing on how God can use you in it? That's what I was doing. I found this neat little app, and here's the tough part for many of us. I don't know if you guys know this about me, because I'm assuming because I'm in the younger demographic that I'm going to naturally just love social media and whatnot. You can ask some of the teens who have been so blessed to inform me I'm old. But I've never really enjoyed social media. If someone posted something on my Facebook, it was my wife keeping me current. Keep in mind that Facebook, as I found out, was for older people to begin with. I didn't even know that. That's just, it wasn't who I was. So part of the issue with me was social media. I'm like, I don't want to be involved in it. But here's the reality. It's a wonderful avenue to get in touch with people around you. A neighbor shared with me this thing called Nextdoor. It's an app where you can actually find out if your neighborhood is part of it, and you get to know your neighbors through this Nextdoor app. So that's just one of the avenues I found. And as I was thinking through this, I'm like, I wanted to provide an example of something you could look for, something you could utilize. Now, I'm sure it's not all for good. I get that. Every kind of media device can be used for good or bad, depending on how you use it. But there are ways out there we can connect with the people around us. And it's on us to find that way and to live it out for Christ. The next thing I wanted us to refocus on is, instead of concentrating on the fear, I want you to refocus from fear to the positives that can happen. See, when we focus in on the fear of what could happen to us, we tend to think negatively. And the reality of it is, whenever you're thinking negatively, you are not thinking of how you can help others or how you can take the next step forward. You're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. And so you need to refocus on the positives. Acknowledge that there are positives that can come from anything because God is involved. Acknowledge that Jesus is in control and had complete knowledge of what was going to happen to us in this day and age, in this time. He knew where you would be. He knew where you would live. He knew what you would be working on or doing. Every single facet he understood. And so his future, his plan that he provided, he saw with clarity. He's asking you to see through him with clarity and trust. Focus on the positives and not the fear that brings about a negative attitude. Because if you're just looking for what can go wrong, you're not going to look to do anything right or see what could go right. And so for that, I was thinking it through is whenever I have an opportunity to be mad at what's going around or things of this nature, I have to, and this is you're just going to have to do this each for yourself. You have to take a moment to stop it and ask God to remind you of some of the positives that have come from this. For me personally, one of those things was I've got to spend more time with my kids in these last 3 or 4 months than I probably have in the bulk of their life. Now, I don't know if they view that as a positive. You can ask them later. But that was a positive. For much of my life, I've worked so much and so often. I didn't get to see them too often, and then God's provided opportunities that I never thought I'd have to reconnect with my family, to do things like game nights, and just have some fun. There's a lot of things that happen during this time that, yeah, some of them are a bummer, but there's a lot of good things that God brought through this, and you can focus on that and use that to help other people. And then last but not least, instead of concentrating on just surviving, I want you to refocus from surviving the crisis to thriving through the crisis. As a church as a whole, we got to do that too. We can't just concentrate on just surviving this. There is opportunity here to further the kingdom of God. There's opportunity here for each of us to become a better neighbor, a better friend, a better Christian, a better spouse, a better parent. Stop trying to just survive it and seek ways to thrive in it, through it, and after it. See, Peter takes moments like this, where he spent with the Lord during his earthly ministry, and goes on to become one of the most amazing men of the Word we have ever known. A man who willingly gives up his life for Christ in the future. And he takes these moments of crisis that he looked back on, and all the disciples had several. And instead of letting it finish them off, they grew through it. And so that's what I want to suggest you today. Find one of these ways to grow through this time. Pastor talked last week about investing. This week I just want to ask you, find a way to grow through this time. Stop just concentrating what's happening around you. Stop fearing what could happen to you, and stop trying to just survive. Change that narrative. God had a goal for you at the start of this year. He had a vision for your life, for the life of this church. And it's up to each and every one of us to reconcentrate on how to get back to that goal in spite of what's going on. As we wind down, those moments of crisis can make a big difference in our life. They can make a huge difference. And as I mentioned before, it doesn't mean you don't take some precautions. It doesn't mean you don't allow some of those things that you learn to change the way you go about business or about life. But it does mean that you shouldn't let them finish off the life God intended for you. So maybe as we move forward and you need to connect with your community, yes, you need to be wise about health risks. Yes, you need to be wise about how you treat other people. But even in spite of that, find ways to help others. It can sometimes be as simple as your next door neighbor is older and you can go out and get their groceries for them. There's little things you can do that can make a huge difference. And so I encourage each of you to do that. I'm going to ask the gentleman to come forward as I close us in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for this opportunity to share the burden you placed on me. I thank you for calling me to the carpet on this, Father, and reminding me that I needed to thrive through this time. I ask, Father, that each person here who's heard your word today, that they would take it to heart and put into practice. Remind them of the goals you set for them, Father, of the vision you placed on both this church and their individual lives. And allow them to refocus on it and to trust that you knew what was happening and what was going on, and that you are going to help us accomplish those things regardless. Thank you again for this time to share your word in Jesus' precious and heavenly name. Amen.